Tufts University Institute for Global Leadership Symposium, Risk and Resilience in an Uncertain World. Thank you for joining us this morning for our panel, Synchronous Flavor, Food Security and the Politics of Hunger. My name is Nicole Figueiredo, and I'm a sophomore studying international relations and child development.
My name is Sophia Gabriel. I'm also a sophomore majoring in IR and minoring in food systems.
My name is Tasha Roseman, and I'm also a sophomore majoring in IR with a double major in civic studies. And the three of us are going to be the student facilitators for this panel. And we thought it would be appropriate to begin the panel with a quick definition of food security. So I can provide that right here. The 1996 World Food Forum or World Food Summit defines food security as existing when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Despite this global commitment, according to UNICEF, over 295 million people across 53 countries face high levels of acute food insecurity. By centering this theme in the Risk and Resilience Symposium, we aim to explore how food systems both generate and mitigate risk, and how innovative policy and community-led solutions can transform vulnerability into resilience.
Food is power. Food is scarcity. Food is abundance. Food is community. But most importantly, food can mean risk or resilience. Food insecurity remains one of the leading drivers of mortality, political instability, and famine worldwide. It is a complex, deeply rooted challenge that fractures nations and strains families, making it central to any serious discussion on global risk. Yet food systems are not only sources of vulnerability, they are also powerful tools for transformation. Positioned at the intersection of climate change, economic fragility, and public health crises, they hold immense political strength to strengthen climate resilience, stabilize communities, and build more equitable futures. When we talk about food, we are not just talking about what is on our plates. We are talking about power structures, survival, and the capacity to endure and adapt.
Today, we will examine these issues by moving beyond the just traditional scarcity narrative. And instead, we'll perform a cross-disciplinary analysis on why our global food system remains fragile. We aim for a fluid, moderate conversation that connects the dots between historical policy failures, corporate economic structure, and and the erosion of democratic accountability. We'll begin with a 5-minute brief opening from each panelist to ground the audience in their specific lens before moving into a moderate conversation and dialogue with questions. We want to explore not just how the system fails, but for whom it is currently working, challenging the audience to see hunger as a political choice rather than an environmental inevitability. I'll now pass to Tasha for her to introduce our amazing guest speakers.
Thank you, Nicole. The first guest speaker that I'll be introducing is Ms. Frances Moore Lappé. She is the author and co-author of 20 books on food, democracy, and social change, including the groundbreaking Diet for a Small Planet, which has sold 3 million copies worldwide. For over 5 decades, her work has challenged dominant narratives about hunger and power, arguing that scarcity is not the root cause of hunger, but that inequality is. She is the co-founder of Food First and the Small Planet Institute and the recipient of the Right Livelihood Award that is often referred to as an alternate Nobel. Now let's hear from Ms. Lappé.
Thank you so much. Do I need to bring in the mic?
Yes.
A little bit, and please, just say something like that if you're not hearing me. Well, I am totally delighted to be here and to be honored and be on my panel. So, when I began in the 1960s, experts were shouting, oh no, we're overrunning the Earth's capacity to feed us. And there was one book called the population fog by a Stanford professor. And I said, oh my gosh, that's a great question. If I could tackle that one, I'd find my path in life. I was just not really trying to. So is scarcity really our problem? That's the question I started with. And so I dug in at the UC Berkeley Library and put two and two together and realized, wait a minute, no, there's more than enough food for all of us. And we, the brightest species, we are actually creating the experience of scarcity no matter how much we're growing. Today, the world, we produce almost 3,000 calories for every person on Earth. And that's after all the waste and loss in producing animal food. And that is more than is recommended for us. So all those calories, that's what's left over after we're using 80% of our agricultural land to produce livestock that return to us only 18% of our calories. And so we've turned agriculture into a giant shrinking machine, if we will. And so I've asked, are these trends getting better or are they getting worse? And I'd say both. 2 billion of us, over 1 in 4, suffer moderate to severe food insecurity in this abundant world, while 318 million people face acute hunger. And that's doubled just in the last, less than a decade. And many more, 821, suffer severe calorie deficit. In the last 4 years, the number has begun to climb again, adding 37 million. 37 million is the population in Canada, to put that in some perspective. So looking not just at calories but nutrition, we learned that stunting from poor nutrition afflicts more than 1 in 5 children worldwide, causing lifelong harm. A third of us are anemic, and it leads to a third, and that is linked to a third of maternal deaths. Calories tell us less and less about well-being, as calories and nutrients are parting ways, as I said. So we get now over half of our calories from ultra-processed food, which I'm going to be focusing on as a symptom of our economic crisis. Another negative I didn't foresee is that our food system generates about a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And on this, my daughter wrote a book called Diet for a Hot Planet. If you wanted to explore that, it's a great source. So how would we, the brightest species, do such a stupid thing as wasting and degrading our own food sources? And so I asked, what's unique about us? We're supposed to be the brightest species, but actually one of the unique features is we see the world not as it is, but as we are, through culturally determined cultures. And literally, we can't see what this fit into our mental mind. That was what hit me from the very beginning when I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. It was so obvious, but we weren't seeing it. So, unique. This is a unique human tendency that believing. We hear seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. That how we believe is so important. It might be okay, but I'm arguing that the global mental map is conversely aligned with nature and human nature, and really killing us. I call it the scarcity scare. It's not anything. There's not enough food, energy, water, time, parking places, love, you name it. And if you could look at the layer in human beings, all we can count on is our selfish nature. And so we have to turn over. We just trust so we just trust ourselves, just trust democracy, and feel we have to turn over our fate to some automatic force. It's called the free market. Free? Wait a minute. No, ours is driven by the wonder world. We'll do what the times future do this well. So we've created a giant game of monopoly, basically. As inequality is worse than over one here, the US is worse than over 100 countries. And the world's 12 richest individuals control about half the world's life. So the result is this tremendous suffering and hijacked that is able to, with concentrated wealth, to hijack democracy and decision making answerable to all of us. Just to give you one example, which I call privately held government, is that there are almost 24 mainly corporate lobbyists applying their interest in Washington for every one person elected to represent us in Washington. the solution. The solution I love to call living democracy. It is not simply a structure of government. It's a way of life. It's a way of everyone having a voice on a daily basis in all aspects of life. And so, solution, what I call living democracy, has three pieces: that citizens, not donors, drive public choices as money is removed from political power and voter participation begins to soar. And when you do that, we have voter turnout very poor in the United States. Transparency, number two, transparency. We all do better when we know somebody is watching. And there's a lot of lack of transparency in our low grade democracy. Three, the idea of mutual accountability. That means we stop pointing fingers out there and it comes full circle to move. We'll step up in the ballot box and with friends and neighbors and helping them in the workplace and just strictly in our communities. And one cool example I just was learning about is people stepping up in their communities directly to take control of their lives is the expansion of community gardens. There are 30,000 community gardens across the United States and increasing in office and government run supermarkets. But we can remove it, but and only we can remove the destructive power of concentrated wealth and ensure life, ensure that we all have a voice in the democracy. And we can all then bring democracy to life. So I would like to just end with Corey. Go ahead, Connie. I'm talking fast.
We were actually hoping if you want to hold that phone till the end, we wanted to close it then.
Okay, wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, though. Okay. The next speaker we'd like to introduce is Dr. Udita Sanga. Dr. Sanga is an assistant professor of climate, food systems, and sustainability at Tufts University's Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. As an interdisciplinary systems scientist, her research focuses on climate adaptation, agricultural sustainability, and food security, particularly in West Africa and South Asia. She integrates participatory approaches and systems modeling to bridge science, policy, and community knowledge in advancing resilient and equitable food systems. Dr. Sanga.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me well? Yes. Okay, great. It is such an honor to be here and be in this wonderful panel and in this room with all you wonderful people. So thank you for the invitation. First, I'd like to start with what we know about world hunger and global food insecurity. Let me throw out some statistics right now. We know that the world is hungry and is getting hungrier over time. There's about 300 million people who are facing critical acute hunger as of 2024 last year. This number is double of what it was, how many people were hungry in 2019. There's also approximately over 600 million people who are undernourished. And nearly half, 50% of deaths of children under 5 happens because of undernourishment. 2.3 billion people, which is a quarter of the world's population, are moderately or severely food insecure, right? And this patterns of hunger are different in different parts of the world, right? According to the Global Food Index, the Global Hunger Index, the hunger is highest in Africa, followed by parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also parts of Latin America. We also know from statistics that the global food production is capable of feeding about 10 billion people, which is more than the 8 billion people that we exist. So the problem is not that we don't have enough food. We know that about half, almost 30 to 45% of the food that we produce right now goes for feed for livestock, and much of it is wasted. And geopolitical conflicts and climate change drive some of these risks. So if it's not a production problem, what is the problem? In my view and in my understanding, it is a systems problem. It's the way the system is structured and how it functions to create famine and create hunger. And it's the system which creates food insecurity for a majority and wasteful abundance in some. And this is where I position my work and my research is in understanding these processes, these social and ecological processes and structures and mechanisms that create food insecurity across the world. And to also, as Francis, you were mentioning about the mental maps. So my work also focuses on understanding people's belief systems, mental models of how they make decisions, how they make actions. So it's individuals, communities, but also organizations. And through systems modeling approaches and systems modeling, in participatory ways of doing that, I identify points of intervention where we might move to systems transformations that might lead to equitable and just and sustainable. A lot of my work focuses in West Africa and South Asia, so that's I'm going to in the panel I'm going to talk a little bit more on those cases. But lately, my work is focusing a lot on indigenous foodways, especially looking at how food is more than a commodity to consume or produce, but food is as a way of identity, of culture, of transmission of intergenerational knowledge, and how it can also be self-sustenance. It can be medication, it can be a form of healing. So I'm happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker we'd like to introduce is Timothy Wise. Timothy A. Wise is a senior research fellow at Tufts University's Global Development and Environmental Institute, where he founded and directed the Globalization and Sustainable Development Program. He is the author of Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, which critically examines the global impacts of industrial agriculture. His work focuses on trade policy, agribusiness power, and the political economy shaping today's food systems. Mr. Wise.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. I used to work just down the street, down Packard Avenue for 20 years, and I've been off campus, but still affiliated with the Global Development and Environment Institute. It's great to be back at Tufts and at Fletcher. I come at this from an economics perspective, from development economics, and I actually set out to write my 2019 book called Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food, because I wanted to understand why in my really 30 years of practical and academic experience in developing countries and in developing country agriculture with farmers, why governments were continuing to adopt policies that were expensive and weren't working for those small-scale farmers, mostly the hungry small-scale farmers, and why they were ignoring the kinds of experiences and models that those same farmers had been creating themselves through their own organizations and in their own communities. And the conclusion I came to out of that research was that they aren't adopting those more inexpensive and effective policies because large-scale agribusiness firms are really running the show, as Frankie Lappé has pointed out. It's a game of monopoly, and things have gotten more and more concentrated, and so fertilizer and seed companies and the rest really drive the agenda, and they drive an agenda that, no surprise, is about trying to increase markets for their products in developing countries. I looked a lot at Africa, so let me just talk a little bit about that here, because it really showed the ways that that our easy assumptions coming out of the global north are so flawed and misguided. The Green Revolution for Africa, started by the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, supported by international donors like USAID, really followed the simple premise that if you can increase productivity in small scale farmers. You do it by increasing their access to industrial scale inputs like commercial seeds and fertilizers like happened in India and in some other countries. And by doing that, their incomes their productivity will increase, their food production will increase, their hunger will decrease, and their livelihoods will improve. And what my own research showed in the book, subsequent to that, is that that has been a complete failure. That all of the incentives to produce more, basically corn and rice, which are basic staple crops, so useful, and you would think a foundation for food security, have instead resulted not in productivity increases. They're subsidizing purchase of seeds, subsidizing purchase of commercial synthetic fertilizers. It's resulted in an expansion of land onto new, onto land that should not be grown on. So environmentally unsustainable. It's not intensifying production as promised, it's extensifying production. And it's displacing peasants from farmland. So the net impact on the livelihoods of those small scale farmers is that they can't afford to farm anymore. And so the net result of all of that is there's been, instead of the promised 50% decrease in food security, this is promised by the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, it's gone up 50%. Instead of productivity increases, most of the production increases, the increased production of corn, for example, has come by putting new land into cultivation, not by productivity increases, the opposite of what was intended. And finally, what all those incentives to modern crops like and commercial crops like corn and rice do is they take land out of more sustainable traditional crops, and you see declines in yields and production for things like sorghum, millet, traditional crops that have been the staple crops for the poor in Africa, poor farmers in Africa, who are the ones suffering the most hunger. So working in completely the opposite direction of diversifying diets, improving nutrition, not just calorie consumption, and creating more safe livelihoods. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And for the last speaker that we'll be introducing, Gabriela Soto Laveaga is the professor of history. She is the professor of the history of science and the Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico at Harvard University. Her award-winning scholarship explores the intersections of science, agriculture, medicine, and political power, particularly in Latin America and South Asia. Her forthcoming book examines Mexico, India, and the global quest to end hunger and reframes how we understand development and agricultural modernization. Why don't you take it away?
So much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here. It's really terrific to be in conversation with all of you. And when they asked us to situate our work within the lens of how we see it, I'm a historian. And I'm a historian both of Latin America and a historian of science. And as such, I was really intrigued by this concept of hunger and where it emerges, because we needed to define hunger. It's not something that came defined to us. So in the mid-20th century, much of the definition of hunger was linked to this notion, as Francis already mentioned, of population growth. That there were parts of the world that were exploding and we would be unable to feed them. You've probably all heard of the Malthusian scheme. That Malthus is that whereas food grows in arithmetic food, that people would exponentially grow, and that there would be this place in which we would be unable to feed them. What we know now is that there has always been enough food to feed everyone who's been on, even today. It's a problem of distribution. It's a problem of how. So I was really intrigued by this. Where did this concept, where did these solutions to end global hunger begin? And everything kept pointing to the mid-20th century, this post-World War II period, where you have a series of nations that are becoming independent for wars of liberation. You also have these emerging nascent nations who are trying to define what kind of country they live in. And many of these countries are agriculture in nature. And what type of agriculture, what type of nation will they be when they sit at the table of all nations? It's also time when the world is being reconfigured from an imperial power to one in which you have the rise of injustice. But you still have this reconception of how do we distribute power in this world. And this is where development aid comes in. Not surprisingly, you will have the nations of Europe and the United States predominantly who dream up of schemes to aid these new nations that will need help in developing themselves toward progress in modernity, an elusive modernity, along this linear line in which traditional to modern, as if it was a formula that we could all become modern along this line of development. Now, if you buy into this, it's very easy to buy into the packages of what is being offered. And one of that was food aid. And food aid would come in the guise of better seeds. And this is where science comes in. Because the idea that if we were going to be an overpopulated world, what you needed was what Tim was telling us. You needed to create more food. That was going to be a solution. It was not going to be a solution about changing the structures of inequality in rural areas. It was going to be about producing more food. So you're trying to apply a math problem to a social problem. You cannot solve a social problem with science. Because hunger is not a scientific problem, it is a social problem, one of inequality. And one of the last things I'll say, and Tim defined the green revolution, and I will as well, because that becomes my launch point. But I think it's really important for us to understand that in the mid-20th century, the ways in which we decided to solve the problems of hunger continue to be the touchstone from which we frame many of the problems. A green revolution for Africa, despite the fact that we already knew by the 1960s that the group was a failed scientific project. We continued to implement it despite the fact. So what was the green revolution? It was the idea of applying technologies and science to better agriculture, creating more crops, better crops, crops that would be designed to resist drought, crops that would be designed to not just drought, but floods and these continue. In the early generation, it would be crops that would produce more. The problem, as others have already stated, is that in order to create these vast tracts that were native of land for all of these crops, you created monocultures around the world. People who had been able to feed themselves for millennia, might have been poor, but they ate. May not have eaten a lot, but they ate. And they ate more nutritiously than they do today. Because now they devote themselves to growing either rice or wheat or corn instead of the diversity of crops that they had mentioned. So what did that mean for the Green Revolution? In order to create more, you needed a lot of agrochemicals, specifically pesticides, insecticides, and fertilizers. And what do small farmers do when they can't purchase this? They rely on bank loans. And there's this cycle of indebtedness because now they need to buy seeds. They used to be able to save, but these new crops, the seeds no longer become less fertile over time. So you need to then purchase all of these inputs which you didn't need to purchase before. In 1970, Norman Borlaug, an American economist, wins the Nobel Peace Prize. The first time that an economist had won it. You probably all heard his name because he's well known as the father of the Green Revolution, and the Peace Prize is given to him for his attempts to end global hunger. 1970. Already in 1970, scientists working with Borlaug, both in India and in Mexico, had discovered that this promise was a flawed scientific solution in 1970. Despite this, he's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And this formula of how we were going to end global hunger continues to this day, being implemented in other regions of the world. I'll stop there, but I have a lot more to say as most historians. You just need to rush us off the stage before we stop talking.
Thank you all for your opening statements. They were all very inspiring. And you can see a breadth of different perspectives and different backgrounds with history to economics. Okay. My first question, you all referenced the fact that the issue is not production, it's distribution or a bunch of other issues. How specifically can we change these distribution systems to be more equitable and to facilitate a production of less hunger globally? And anyone can take it up and then we'll go one by one.
Get started if you want. I mean, I can start us on that because it comes straight off of the comments that I just made. I think that what all of the speakers have addressed is I mean, I think it's Frankie Lappé who's written that the hungry don't suffer from a scarcity of food; they suffer from a scarcity of power. And I think that's what I discovered in my own research out in various parts of the world. I pose this question to you. This is for a whole series on resilience. You know, you really have to ask what you're trying to be resilient to. What are you trying to protect yourself against? And if it's hunger, then what the main cause of hunger is poverty. So you need to protect yourself against poverty. So that's where Frankie comes at inequality being one of the underlying causes of hunger. What's really needed then are policies and practices that either increase the productivity and the self-provisioning and the autonomous production of food in small-scale farming communities to increase their food security, or you need good jobs. And the assumption, as Gabriela has pointed out, that we're going to follow the northern development model, and that as we industrialize agriculture and there are fewer jobs in agriculture, there'll be jobs for people to move to. There aren't. There are not jobs being created in the vast majority of developing countries that are formal sector jobs that pay benefits, that have decent wages, and that allow a decent standard of living. So go to Lagos, go to any of the large African capitals, and you'll find overwhelming slums of people who have been displaced from agriculture and have nowhere to go. That is one of the false assumptions of this free market development for agriculture, is that the jobs will come. You can displace people from agriculture by increasing capital investment in agriculture, industrializing agriculture, and building places for people to go.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that opening. I think if you were to travel anywhere in the world where you see, for example, if you go to Central America, which the term that banana republics that was coined in the 20th century, these banana exporting or fruit exporting Central American nations, what you will see is that these are nations that are feeding the world, but most of those who are picking the crops cannot feed themselves for their family. Or the level of malnutrition or so on. But you don't need to just look at Central America. If we think about something that we all have grown to love, which is the avocado, we are the #1 consumers of avocados now, and those come from Mexico. And so when we think about what happens if this supply chain or this distribution of avocados were to shift, for example, in Michoacán, currently the drug cartels have made the situation of the production of avocados much more difficult. What does that mean for us? So when we're talking about distribution, we need to define what that means. Because if we're talking about the distribution of a specific crop, like bananas or avocados, that means that there's certain security. When we're talking about a whole flavor of nutritious food, that It's learning distribution, which I think what everyone on this panel is defining, then becomes a lot more difficult to do. And that is where power comes into play. When I initially started my research, I was not expecting the answer or one of the answers to be the unresolved land struggles of the countries I was researching. I thought that was so far removed from this notion of hunger that we were experiencing, especially in the 20th century and the 21st century. But it turned out that visiting these places, you still had individuals, Native Americans, natives from these spaces, that were still hundreds of years later fighting and struggling for the land in order to grow their own food. This is significant because when we talk about the distribution of power, if you don't have land to farm, if you don't have, you then need to look for work elsewhere, and that becomes part of the wage economy. And that means that you become dependent on different levels, a hierarchy of dependency. So what I was seeing was this extraordinary link between colonization that had happened centuries earlier, that had continued in different guises, and that had manifested itself over time. So it wasn't a problem of the 19th century, the 20th century. It was a problem in which individuals who had lost their land, something that Tim had said, they could no longer farm. They could no longer grow their food. And when opportunities came to grow, it wasn't to grow diverse, it was to grow something like bananas or to grow something like avocados. But we don't need to go too far to think about power structures and the food that we produce. California is our nation's food basket. It is where the majority of our fruits and vegetables come from. The majority of those who harvest the crops are undocumented workers. A majority of those who harvest the food that we consume in the United States are undocumented workers. When we talk about power, we don't need to go far to think about the imbalance of power in the food system, because we just need to look at how the food that arrives to our table, if we trace it back, what that labor was that produced it.
I just want to jump in with a memory that was so inspiring to me that addresses so much of what we're talking about that couldn't happen anywhere. But do you know about the movement in Belo Horizonte in Brazil? If any of you heard about that, where they decided they were going to have zero hunger. I visited that and talked to the founder of the movement, Zero Hunger. And they just did the most obvious things, like they had these outdoor, there's a roof to it, but that farmers brought in their food, and that there was some kind of substance access for everybody, and they had school lunches that were really healthy, and they went on and on. And so they reduced, I've forgotten the statistic, but reduced hunger dramatically in a short period of time. And I got to meet with one who started it, and I said, "Oh, Adriana, aren't you thrilled? Aren't you thrilled?" And she said, "Oh, we should have started earlier." So they were very humble about what they'd achieved, and so I think of those examples that we need to spread. I think the Wangari Maathai, Greenbelt movement, another example. So I just want this part of our work as a listener is holding power, and it's the same thing that you can share with us.
As I'm listening to you, one of the things that I mentioned was about how hunger is concentrated in certain parts of the world. And one of the things that really frustrates me, especially when I'm working in the global south, is the narrative of, the victim narrative of like poor Africans, who are victims of and that frustrates me. I've worked in the Sahelian region, which is a region in the 1960s to the 1980s. There was a series of droughts which created a lot of changes and agroecological changes, transformations, and also changes in how people live based on the policies and some of the stories of age, and foreign investments that were made in that country, right? And so the narrative shifted that because of the droughts, the African system, the agricultural system, shifted from a high resilience state to a low resilience state. And I want to counter that. And there's several other scholars also who are countering this narrative that, Africa is less resilient. African farmers are quite innovative and are able to maintain and sustain despite a lot of like these bigger challenges that impact them, right? And so I want to touch into what Tim said about the agribusiness models and some of the policies that we've mentioned here, and how they influence the system and change the cropping systems from traditional, let's say, sorghum and millet, which are resilient crops and can withstand climate stressors, to more of corn and maize and rice, which can also lead to long-term environmental degradation. And I want to push into also how we're talking about food security, because I want to bring into more recent conversations about how food security is also about agency and it's about sustainability. And when we talk about agency, it's the capability of people to determine what food they produce, what food they consume, but also take part in the policy processes that shape these systems. And I think one of the solutions could be, as we are noticing, that a lot of these harmful policies created well because the people who were impacted by them the most were not invited into the table. They did not participate. A lot of these policies came from outside. If we bring the people in the table, we can bring in their knowledge that already exists, which are already resilient. And that's what we need to I think, solve the global problem.
Thank you, our speakers. As we're talking about the main drivers around the world, I was wondering, just like a more general question, why the system currently fail? And I think Dr. Sanga, you just touched on that, the lack of self-determination and agency. But what are also other drivers in the countries you have studied that are like currently stopping the policies from working, yet economically and politically?
I'll give you a history of science answer to this. So why did the system fail as we had envisioned it? So the Green Revolution, the ideas of the Green Revolution launched from Mexico, where Norman Borlaug was doing research in northern Mexico, in this research station. And this part of northern Mexico had always been envisioned since the time of the Spaniards who had controlled Mexico, that this would be an area of food mass production, that this would be wheat fields. And Mexico's not known for wheat. Mexico's known as the land of corn. So in the 1940s, when the Rockefeller Foundation, together with the Mexican government, decided to create a program called the Mexican Agriculture Program, or MAP, they based it on this idea that they're going to produce more food using agrotechnology. And the space where they're going to use it is not in central Mexico, which looked like a lot of the rest of the world's farmers did, small scale farmers that had at most maybe an acre or a couple of acres, generally poor, mostly indigenous. But instead, they go to this research station in the north, in which it was large commercial farmers. So the model that was designed to ship to the rest of the world was a model that was based not on the small scale farmers of Mexico, which Mexico had a lot of in central and southern Mexico, but rather these vast tracts of land. Is you take that formula and try to implement it in South Asia, in India, in Pakistan, and in later various African nations. It wasn't going to work because you wouldn't be able to produce the same measures. So a scale was created that you were doing it well if you produce this many tons of wheat per yield. But if you didn't reach that, then you must have been doing something wrong. And by you, I meant the country. And so that meant you need to apply more fertilizer. You need to apply more agrochemicals. Because the formula that had been developed, or which was seen as success, was based on this model of a Mexico that was a wealthy Mexico. These were commercial farmers. So to get to your question of why did the system fail, a formula was attempted to be applied to the rest of the world as if the world were uniform, instead of looking at local problems, local histories, local meaning, and local solutions. When we do that in our world, when we try to select one solution and apply it globally, that is when we encounter resistance and problems. And that's the problems that we were seeing because people began to apply more fertilizer, and what you begin to have is agroecological disasters attempting to reach that scale of success.
This reminds me of an example of irrigation. And one of the studies that I did on groundwater management in arid regions in India. And India is the highest, has the highest rates of groundwater withdrawal. And it's highly dependent on groundwater. So the narrative is that farmers want to pump more and more groundwater because they want to increase yield. So we wanted to explore this. And the study was in western part of India. And so we examined mental models of farmers around groundwater management. And what we found was that we looked at three different zones. So there was the scarcity zone, there was the zones with assured rainfall. And we noticed, and when we spoke to the farmers, they told us, especially farmers in the scarcity zone, had the highest beliefs about groundwater sustainability, and they were more oriented towards groundwater conservation as opposed to the more assured rainfall zones. And that was counterintuitive. When we analyzed how the historical policies shape how it impacts people's decisions and actions, you start to notice patterns. Because of subsidies around electricity and irrigation, farmers are moved towards that system where it's easier to extract more groundwater as opposed to when you conserve more water. And we see evidence of that because in the 1990s, there was a big movement around watersheds and conservation of water where communities were mobilized. And so during that duration, there was a lot of training, people came together to conserve more water and rainwater harvesting, and people did that. But once the policies were gone, once the projects were over, farmers again shifted back to this patterns of extraction. So it's about system scale because it's the policies that enable them to move in one direction or the other. That's I think what it is.
I mean, just to build on that, one of the places that I went to research my book was Iowa. Where did this model come from? And how's it working in Iowa? And it's not working well in Iowa. Go to Iowa and you see huge environmental problems, soil erosion, water pollution, and depopulated rural communities that have been hollowed out by these policies. I talked to a really interesting ecologist working there who was trying to work at the edges of that system and saying, what could we do to the typical soybean corn rotation farm that would increase the sustainability, decrease the environmental impacts of that farm. And he had an experimental farm called Marsden Farm. I write about it in the book. It's very well documented now, and still an experiment going on, in which you have a control group of a typical corn soy farm, and then he did changes to that model, small changes. One was to have one additional rotation of grass, alfalfa, which could be fed to animals. By simply adding that, they decreased water pollution to zero coming off the land from runoff. They decreased soil erosion to zero, stabilizing the soil. They decreased herbicide use by 93%. They decreased fertilizer use by 84%. And I said to him, after he showed me this, I said, well, this is win-win-win. This is what everybody's looking for. How many farmers in Iowa are using it? And he said, and I'll never forget what he said, almost none. I couldn't have invented a program that more directly impacted the most powerful agribusinesses in the state. Do you think Koch Industries that produces fertilizer wants to see an 83% decrease in fertilizer sales? No. Do you think Monsanto, who sells the herbicides, wants to see a 90% decrease in herbicide sales? No. Do you think the factory farms that benefit from super cheap corn and soybeans want to see a slight decrease in the production of corn and soybeans with the addition of another crop? No, because their prices would go up with the input cost, which is feed made from corn and soybeans. All of the agribusinesses aligned against the proliferation of those policies. And in spite of their obvious benefit to society, they weren't adopted.
Okay, thank you for those statements. Earlier, two of you guys, Mr. Wise and Professor Laveaga, touched on the Green Revolution. And in an ever-changing and digitizing world, there's often a contrast between the trust in technology and the resistance toward these systems. I would like to know how you see the current and future role of technology in food systems.
That's a history of science question for everyone.
I love that question. How do you see a future and where does technology, the areas where I do my research are fascinating for historian technology. For example, CIMIC, which everyone on this panel is familiar with, is the center for the improvement with maize and wheat. And you might be surprised to learn that you've all probably heard of the Svalbard seed bank in Norway, which is called the Doomsday Bomb. If we attempt to kill ourselves with the bombs, that potentially the seeds will survive. Because without seeds, we really need the seeds. But outside of Mexico City, there's another, it's not a seed vault, it's a seed bank. It's the largest seed bank in the world. It's a seed bank of wheat and corn. It goes several stories down into it. And what they have is stored seeds from around the world. But these are seeds that are working seeds. They're constantly being researched on to create better varieties of seeds. Why? Because we are a climate changing world. The world that we are all living in today, it's happening so quickly, is not the same world that will be 10 years from now, 15, 20 years, which means that the seeds need to be adapted for a future that we are already living in now. Just think of the floods in Pakistan that destroyed entire fields, or the drought that's currently going on in Mexico and has been going on for years in the breadbasket of Mexico. So what you have right now, and this is what at the time in 2013, the richest man in the world was Carlos Slim, a Mexican, and he and Bill Gates teamed up together at CIMIC outside of Mexico City to create what they called the biosafety lab, to try to design seeds for the coming hunger, the coming famines that would impact. So what you have is this constant betterment of seeds, but you probably, if you're paying attention, at the beginning of what I said was that bettering seeds was not the solution. So what they're doing now in terms of technology is still attempting to better the crop, the seed, but not changing the systems of inequality that allow for this maldistribution. And I'll just say one other quick thing. One of the amazing things about agrotechnology is that whereas before knowledge was coming as a development aid idea, was being posed, and this plays out something you said earlier, what you have now is this dialogue between local communities, nations, and regions of the world in which they are taking up what they have called heritage seeds. Seeds that were displaced by these better seeds. You have these heritage seeds of rice, of wheat especially, and being replanted in communities because that is the soil and environment without these agrochemicals. So you have these communities that are using ancestral technologies and retaking them back as a way to counter what we're seeing. So there is some hope if you're using less fertilizer, but you're also mining the technologies and the knowledge that existed before our world was so changed. And this is really the last point I'll make because it's a really interesting one about technology. So in this space in northern Mexico, where they use drones to measure the canopy heat that's coming out of the crops, and they say that it's one of those technified valleys, like Silicon Valley, but it's about agriculture. Where each amount of water is measured to the liter, and they control it all remotely. But also, it's the jungle's covered through drone and control, etc. But they share this knowledge. For example, they had designed a tractor and sent it to Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe said, "That's great, but it doesn't work in our terrain. We tweaked some things. What do you think?" Sent it back. And so then Mexico was like, "Oh, this is interesting, but it doesn't work for our terrain." So you now have are these south-south connections that are happening at a quicker scale, in which you're seeing technologies and innovation that is coming from the global south, and it is fascinating. In that, if you're going to be looking into where agro-technology is coming, you need to go to the global south. Because when you have fewer funds, you become more creative.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd add to that, which I think is exactly what I've seen out there in the world. I mean, this is particularly true in the United States, in which the development discourse is dominated by people like Bill Gates, who is a technology guy, right? And the issue is innovation, not technology, and they're equated. They're essentially innovation is reduced to technology. Technology is reduced to industrial scale technology. What we see and what I think you're describing is a lot of innovation. There's this image that sort of traditional farmers going back to their traditional seeds are moving backwards. It's not backwards. It's actually the best practices are being done in conjunction with scientists who are helping them figure out what is the best. I mean, it's a great project in Malawi that I saw that. What is the best leguminous crop to plant alongside your crop so that you're both rebuilding the fertility of the soil, getting another crop, and increasing the productivity of your corn without having to buy expensive fertilizers that most of the small farmers can't afford. Tripled yields of corn, increased carbon sequestration in the soil, increased fertility of the soil over the long term, so that it's a much more resilient system. Increased water retention, so floods and droughts, they're much more resilient to these floods and droughts. That's innovation. Is it technology? I don't know. I don't care. I mean, and in fact, I think the focus on technology is actually missing the point. I mean, it's really the narrowing of the question of technology is missing the point. Sure, there's some precision agriculture techniques that can be very useful in industrialized systems to reduce water use and the like. But when we're talking about hunger and talking about small scale farmers, that's not what you're talking about. Innovations in practices that often involve resisting dependence on what we call technology.
I'd like to add to those points that you made. It's about when we talk about innovations, there's the dominant model of innovation that we often think about, the diffusion model of technology and innovation, right? Like where innovation is developed somewhere and most likely by scientists and then disseminated to farmers who then adopt. And usually it's the early adopters, the more innovative, more experimental farmers who adopt, and then they see the benefits of that technology. And then they spread the word, and then the innovation gets diffused and adopted by other farmers. Now, I'm not critiquing it. It's this kind of model is dominant, but there's another kind model of innovation too, which is the spiral model of innovation, which is more bottom up, where farmers experiment too. They innovate, they experiment on certain practices, agroforestry and other kind of like practices. They self-select seed varieties, and over time they develop that. And then through consensus building within the village or within like the community, this innovation then spreads out. And Gabriela, you were talking about Now, the challenge with this kind of a model is issues of scalability, because it remains localized within that, and the transmission of this knowledge is not as easy to broader communities. So it's not, I think, like, it's not a question about like either or of which one is better, but I think it's a matter of like, how do we ensure that innovations which come from the bottom up are scaled and are also, widely, communicated, as the top-down approaches are more aligned ecologically and socially to the realities of the place that they're meant to work.
Well, yeah, I'm so learning so much. I wanted to bring us back to the question of access to democracy, and because, as you know, the earth everything less than the fortune. So I'm 82, so that means that I've lived through many stages in here. And when I was young, just out of college, my first job was with the War on Poverty, and we don't hear about that. But I was an organizer with the War on Poverty, and I helped very, very poor families get access to food. And during the 1960s, I believe there was like a 40% reduction. I have to check my facts, but there was a significant reduction. And so I want to bring it back to what we can do together to create democratic decision making that is truly accountable, that nobody in the country wants people to go hungry. And so if there is hunger, it means that our voices are not being heard. I mean, nobody, I'm sure there's some people who make me mind that she has more hunger, but no, so I just want to remind us that, we have stepped up before in not in any perfect way, but we made significant progress.
Thank you. Now we will open it up for questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself and address your question to a specific panelist.
Hi, Megan Trumbull, third class from the Naval Academy. I had a question for you, Mr. Wise. Specifically, you said earlier that we had a problem with power, that our lack of food had to do with that inequality. And I find that extraordinarily interesting, because when we say power, it can mean so many different things. So I wanted to know, how are you defining power as we address this problem?
That's certainly a big question. I think it's useful to think of the power over money. So access to funds is a form of power. Power over food producing resources like land, that's a form of power. And then there's power over the economic and political factors that affect your ability to exercise those other powers, government and corporate power. The first two are pretty clear. You need some land, and you need some seeds, and you need some water, and you need irrigation. And that gives you some power as an industrial farmer. You need, but when it comes to power over the kinds of policies that affect life, that affect your ability to secure a livelihood, that's collective, and that needs to be collective, and that's where I think that's what Frankie's talking about a lot, is this idea of living democracy. I've seen it in lots of parts of the world in the course of this research, where remarkable levels of organization in different communities, in the state of Puebla, indigenous community, Mexico's had a land reform from its revolution in the 20th century. Land was redistributed. 50% of the land is in the hands of farming and indigenous communities. 50% of the agricultural land, not as individual titles, but as collective land. So it can't be just bought and sold. They control their land. They can, because they're an indigenous community, they have the right to make decisions independently, a relevant amount of autonomy about how they run their own communities. And they've built a collective power of 410 different cooperatives, 30,000 families in a territory where they maintain their own bilingual Spanish and Nahuatl and native language schools to build indigenous pride and strength in the culture. And that gives them the power to defend a system in which they're growing crops in a traditional way. They're not isolated from the international community. They're exporting shade-grown coffee and pepper to China. But they have a level of autonomy and control. They have a territorial self-defense committee, which is intended to prevent mega projects from coming in and taking over lands that they shouldn't take over. They've had produced an entire ecological zoning of their territory that allows them, by Mexican law, to define the kinds of land use that they want in their communities, and basically excludes mega projects like hydroelectric dams. They've fought off a Walmart being put into their communities because they don't want to be eating Walmart food and they don't want to be undermining the local economy. That's an exercise in power, local autonomy. That's more than just, it goes way beyond the individual.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. It was a fantastic discussion. My name is Aliena Batura. I'm a political scientist. I want to react to many things that I heard in this discussion, so I appreciate your patience and allowing me to formulate my question as I speak. So the panel's title begins with failure. So first, I want to orient my question towards thinking about some ways that we can address these problems and actually achieve a measure of success in the future. And I'll start by saying that it seems that climate change will exacerbate all of the problems that you mentioned. So we really need to think hard about solutions. So I will reference some of the things that I heard in the discussion. One of you mentioned that social problems do not always have scientific solutions. So I would like to maybe encourage us to think about and discuss different ways of knowing. I would say that it's important to maybe broaden the definition of science, because there's social science, there's history, and history is a form of science. So it's a form of knowing. So maybe the solution is to bring in this other sciences or ways of knowing to what we think of science traditionally. I'll also mention that we talked about the shift from traditional production to modernity, which seems like it created a lot of the environmental and social stresses that we are discussing right now. And modernity seems to be, based on this notion of science and rationality and seeking solutions to this means, with assumption that science is based on basically materialism. And again, I want to reference another thing that I heard, indigenous ways, maybe indigenous ways of knowing, and how that can inform our solutions, and the idea of cultural mental maps. So now I'm finally getting to my question is, what are some of the ways in which we can broaden our use of human knowledge and perhaps adopt alternative or different mental and cultural maps, so that we can use this to think of innovative and better ways to solve our climate challenges that bear on ecosystems. But sorry, it was very long.
Yeah, I'd love to, especially talking about science. Thank you so much for the question. It's because this is something that I've been reflecting on quite a bit, especially with the project on indigenous food systems. And in this project, we're looking at intergenerational loss of food knowledge in Eastern India. Among and by the way, we don't often talk about indigenous communities in India, but there's 10 million, which is the largest indigenous people in the world, and we don't talk about that. I myself am indigenous, and I come from eastern part of India. So this project has been very personal and very meaningful to me. But I'm trained as a systems scientist, and that's how we evolve. And so when I started this project, it started from a very personal space in collaboration with other folks at Tufts University where we're bridging what we know about system science and how we look at food waste. And here I define food waste as what is food and according to whom, and how are the processes and ways we produce, consume, distribute food. And what is considered edible food, because that's different for different communities, right? And so we're looking at bridging indigenous research and what indigenous epistemologies talk about, food waste, how system science thinks about it, and how anthropology has looked at it. And it's been a very interesting process because it arises question. I don't have the answers for you, but I'm going to pose the question that I'm asking myself. Is we in academia hold a lot of power because what we research, what questions we pose, how we frame a problem, how we frame a solution goes into these policy spheres, and that's how solutions are made. So we're not detached from it. We're not mere observers of a phenomenon. We're participants in it. And so when we're trained in this kind of a science, which talks about top-down approaches or whatever, I've been reflecting on, because I get this often, is okay, indigenous science, but what is it? Is it really science? Then again, there are what are the frameworks they use and how can we bridge them to it? Then there's the question of how are we even generating this knowledge? So traditionally, when we do science, in social sciences, we go and collect data. And it's usually the external who goes and collects data, then analyzes the data in a lab or in computers, and then make an assessment of what it is. But the process in which how we're kind of pushing the boundaries here a little bit is that we have a local research team who is completely indigenous. They are scholars and researchers from the area who know the language. And the way we're working with the community is through networks. We're talking to our grandmothers, we're talking to our grandfathers, talking about it and reflecting on it. But there's some boundaries that I'm facing, some resistance to, on how do we include them in the scientific process, which is including publication. How do we talk about what does it mean? Because they're traditionally not a part of that system. The way we also, because here what's happening in the project is that this is becoming more than an academic exercise or project, because the community is taking ownership of that, because that's their story, it's not our data. It's their data, it's their story, and they're going to take what information that we have. So what's the role of science within that? I don't have the answers to that, but I want to help that answers your question. Maybe not, but poses more questions to deliberate on.
If I can also, when we were asking how do we broaden our use of human knowledge, I was really struck by your question, how you posed it. Because I think when we think about how to broaden, we tend to think of empowerment, and we tend to think of education, and we tend to think of financial incentives or financial pathways. But we often don't talk about respecting difference. And here it's about respecting different knowledge systems and not seeing them as either or lesser than, but seeing them as equitable, different. And I think a large part when we talk about agriculture success and about different agricultural systems is that we tend to put them on a different balance. And we tend to put science and technology as if it were a different measure, better than the knowledge that is transmitted either orally or through other means. And we live currently in a world in which difference is not something that is applauded, but rather, so if we talk about different knowledge systems and giving them equal value, and I want to very quickly give this quick anecdote just to give us a reference of this. In the 1950s, banks would only loan money to farmers in this northern part of Mexico if they were planting specific types of seeds. So this goes back to the question that you posed about power. And you might have wanted to plant a different type of seed, but you could not get a bank loan. You were going to plant the seeds that the bank inspector was going to check that you had planted. So this is a way to get you into the system. So even if you're trying to create different knowledge systems, there's an entire infrastructure out there, such as a bank loan. The bank would not loan you if you weren't doing what was considered right. So I love your question, but we need to change our frame about what we understand as being a correct or fashionable knowledge system.
Thank you guys so much. I think we have time for one more question. Before though, I have a special request for all our lovely panelists to move the microphone just a little bit closer so that we can hear you better. Just like if you guys all pull the microphones in like a couple of perfect. Thank you. And for our question.
Thank you, Miss Moore Lappé, is that how I say it? My name is Hudson, and I'm from the Naval Academy. I just want to clarify an argument you made. You said scarcity is not the cause of food insecurity. It is inequality. You also pointed to the avoidance of concentration of power and wealth. And you said 12 individuals control 40% of the world's wealth. So, in my mind, is there a solution to tax these 12 people and use that money to buy that, I guess, abundance of food and give it to these people like poor nations like Africa and Southeast Asia you pointed out too? Is that like kind of your argument?
Well, I think that's a little unrealistic unless we actually go to a deeper root, and that is how is it that we've gotten a quote unquote democracy that is so controlled by private interests? And so that's really key, I think, and that we have to be constantly challenging, understanding that in democracy in the world, the United States ranked 57, where we think that most of us think we're up there at the top. And we've been there for quite a while. And we can't address any of the deepest problems unless we have the democracy answering to the people and not to private interests. So I just want to repeat that core theme in all that we do. There are, in our communities, definitely we have to step up and be as immediately helpful as we can. But always spread the word and do whatever we can to support a candidate to bring into any conversation about an election, about who is going to address the power of private money, corporate lobbyists, and voter suppression. How are we going to get beyond those? And so that's to me, it's kind of encouraging that we rank so low because a lot of people work.
Thank you. Before we close, do any of our panelists have any quick closing thoughts that you didn't get to speak during the panel?
I would like to have the word. As we were speaking, it reminded me of when I was in Botswana, in Serowe. There was a small, very small museum, and in the case, there was this letter that had been sent to Chief Kuso, and it was right after World War I. And together with the letter, there was this image of a starving mother and with an emaciated infant, who turned out to be was a child of 6, but was so emaciated, looked like a month old. And you probably already have the image in your mind because you've all seen that image of hunger. The difference is that it was a white woman, a European woman, holding an emaciated white child. And the letter was requesting from Chief Kama of Africa, of what now became Botswana, if they could send money and food to Europe because Europe was hungry. And so Chief Kama writes to the other chiefs, and that was the letter that was in the museum. And it begins by saying, "We who in Africa have so much must help our brothers and sisters in Europe." So this is 1917. What happened to our world that was flipped upside down? That at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was turning to this rich continent of Africa for aid. And I want to leave you with that thought, because when that anecdote addresses so many of the themes that we were talking about power, but also how we narrate histories of hunger and how we place the narratives of innovation in other spaces and how we think about who is hungry and who feeds the world. That's the thought that I would like to leave you with.
Wow, thank you so much. And thank you for such fruitful questions from our audience and then responses that explore distribution, power, exploitation, and resilience in food systems from Mexico to India to the United States. You've left us with so many systemic and complicated issues and inspiring solutions to think about. I would now like to hand it over to Mrs. Lappé for a closing poem.
Well, I believe that hope is power. And so this hangs in our office at Small Planet Institute. Hope cannot be said to exist, nor can it be said not to exist. For it is like the roads across the earth. In the beginning, there were no roads, but when many people passed one way, a road is made. Thank you. Chinese poet Yin Su.
Thank you everyone for being here today, and a huge thank you for May's guest speakers for being here and joining us in this amazing conversation. We're now going for a break. You can join us on the 7th floor for lunch, and then we're gonna be.
I'm sorry. I apologize. The lunch is open to kind of the students and the panelists.
Oh, I apologize for that. And we're gonna be back here at 1 p.m. For a keynote address, "When Systems Fail: Power, Security, and Survival," featuring Dr. Jake Goldstone. Thank you, everyone.